What a nice group. I was trying, as I was driving in this morning, trying to think of a great opening line. And after seeing the news yet again, I'm not sure that I really have one. Except that, as we have said, I have said, and many other people have said, you can't make this stuff up. And we're 4 or 5 days from a year. I think I believe January 30th is the State of the Union address. Many months ago, first let me say, my name is Maynard Goldman, and in the spring of 2014, I decided it might be an interesting idea to teach an OSHER course, which Iliad OSHER at that time, I think they were in the process of shifting over. I took a class that OSHER offers on teaching OSHER classes. Hank Bohmeyer taught that class. Some of you may have had Hank. And it got me started. The first class I taught was on Massachusetts politics, which deserves more than one class. And then I had this crazy idea about doing a series of courses around the 2016 presidential election. We were still early in 2015. And so I did a series of 3 courses, starting with the spring of 2015, called The Greatest Show on Earth. I mean, that was before anyone had declared. I had no idea what was going to happen. And then, of course, we finished up the day after the election. The last class was actually the day after the election in the fall of 2016. And I then did a class on the first 100 days, and I said to myself, self, that's enough. I can't take any more of this. So last semester I did a course on Ted Kennedy, which at least took me out of the present. And but I think that this topic is very prescient. I think is not and so before we get into it, there's a bunch, as you know, of housekeeping things that we need to do. This course is unusual in several respects. Unusual for me and perhaps for you, in that we're doing 4 classes within a 2-week period. Tuesday, Thursday, Tuesday, Thursday. I'm hopeful that having all of us together for that much time in close proximation will not prove troublesome. I do have a bad cold, for which I apologize, but there doesn't seem to be anything I can do about that. And let me emphasize here that it's my experience over these 7 or 8 or whatever it is classes that I have been a study leader for, that the success of these classes depends on all of us. And it's not just the study leader, but to the extent that each of you, all of you, participates, I think it's a richer experience for us all. One of the interesting things about a class of this type of current political issues is that, in my view at least, there are no right and wrong answers. Everybody clearly has their own opinions about these kinds of things. I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm not here to try and convince you of a particular position on any of these issues. I am here to try and explain what I understand to be the facts of certain situations about what we will talk. And when I began thinking about this class a while ago, there are two things that were kind of paramount in my mind. One was, what was the likelihood that this was going to be a real issue at some point during the 4-year period that the president is likely to serve? And it seemed to me that there was a very strong probability that these questions, it's not a single question, were going to be discussed. And we see a lot of discussion already in the news, the commentators, etc. I think I saw this morning there are 2 new books which have just hit the newsstands. One by a longtime follower of the president, David Johnston, I think is his name. He's written at least 2 or 3 books on Trump going back into the 80s.
The tax guy?
Yeah. And then a second one by David Frum, who has just released a book on the first year of the presidency. And so, and I think I saw that the president filed a lawsuit against Michael Wolff. That's number 4,892. I'm not sure. I lost it somewhere. But in any event. So I think that's kind of point one. So let me, before we get into the meat, let me go through a number of, I've sent some things to you already which I hope you've received. I could have sent you a lot more. I have a lot more. And if any of you are interested in a particular topic, I may be able to provide you some sites for some additional information. The first thing I think we should do is introduce one another. We'd like to, obviously, we don't want to take too much time with these introductions. I've had many of you in classes before. I thank you for returning. Some of you I don't know, and I thank you for coming. But I think if you tell us your name, and I thought it might be interesting to get one question from you, from each of you, as to what question you have as you're coming into this class that you think is important that you would like answered. I can't promise you that we'll have an answer, but it would help me and perhaps enlighten all of us as to the area or concern that is of particular concern to you. Joan, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. Joan Jaffe. The only question I have right off the top of my head is that I thought I understood what the terms were. The actual events that are taking place now put a lot of that in question in my mind. So what I'd like to know is how much is a continuum from the original concepts and how much is a distortion?
We're talking about pardons now?
Pardons,
right.
Things about
Okay. Well, we are going to talk about today the history of the pardon process in this country and a little bit about where it came from. And we'll raise that very question. Peter?
Yes, Peter Jaffe. I became interested in pardons when I became apoplectic over Ford's pardon of Nixon. And what I hadn't considered then, or actually until now, was the possibility that Nixon could have pardoned Nixon. And in the same context as to whether or not Trump can pardon Trump. And so I'd like...
Well, that is a topic that we will, in fact, talk about probably, it'll be next week, and in the third or fourth session.
Hi, Richard Waddell. I took Maynard's course on Ted Kennedy, and it was wonderful. And so that's
Louder.
Okay, I took Maynard's course on Ted Kennedy, which was last term, and it was fabulous. And I saw this one, and I knew that it would be great. So I have so many questions, but I guess the overriding one for me would would be to wonder if, aside from pardoning himself, if he wanted to do that, whether he would go so far as to pardon other people who might be implicated in some of the stuff that is going on. So.
Next question.
I'm Susie Wag. I'm come from a long line of lawyers in the family, and
That's very dangerous.
I am not a lawyer. My father was, and he was also in the Massachusetts Supreme Court legislature, and all of this legal, all of the ifs and buts and so on fascinate me, other than being worried also. So that's where I'm coming.
Well, I know Dave is a lawyer. Are there any other lawyers in the class? Peter. And so there are three of us. Now, that's big trouble. Tim?
I'm Tim Wag. Not being born an American, I just find this fascinating.
Unbelievable.
Unbelievable. One thing I'm interested in is, can the states do something individually against the president,
Nice question.
which he could not pardon him?
Nice question. And that issue about the states and the feds is definitely something we'll get into. Yes, sir.
My name is David Russell, and I don't really have a specific question. I was just interested when Trump pardoned Sheriff Arpaio, the whole question of using pardons as a political tool to either intimidate or persuade others not to testify against him becomes just a subject that's fascinating.
Very good. Yes, Roy.
My name's Roy Black. I come from a family of lawyers. My nephew is the fourth generation to practice law in Vermont. And I don't have any particular question, actually. Been trying to think of something.
That's all right. Well, I'm sure you'll have some as we go along. Muffy.
Muffy Gibson, and I was also, I hadn't thought about pardons since Nixon, and the last year has been so disturbing. I found your subject matter fascinating and would like to learn more about it.
Thank you. Susan?
Susan Valiente, and my question goes along with what David had said about the use of pardons for political advantages.
Bev?
Okay, I'm Beverly Sletton. I just changed my question.
Can you speak up? Speak up a little?
Yes, Beverly Sletton, just changed my question. I guess what I am now concerned about is what can Mueller get him on so that he would need to be pardoned? So I'm kind of still at that point of what has he done? Is being crazy enough to get him? Or is money laundering something that they can go into? Or what exactly gets him to the point where someone would have to pardon him?
His name is spelled Mueller. I think they pronounce it Muller. The E, I think, is silent in any event. Yes, Bob?
I'm Bob Sletton. I was more focused around impeachment and those kinds of questions, which I guess we'll touch on.
We will.
And I think my question is, you as a longtime watcher, and all of us old enough to have been through Watergate and Clinton and all the rest of it, how does this compare to that, to any of that?
Fair enough. Barb?
Barbara Parry, and I'm just looking for some hope that somebody will be held accountable.
Bob?
We're all savvy as far as history of how the country exists in government, and the rules of law. And we're all aware of what the media has to say now, ad nauseum. I'm curious, what will the United States look like as a federal operating government and a society who might like a lot more than they do responsible citizenship? What will this country look like in 5 years? Not
Nice.
history, not current events.
Can we look forward? And one of my favorite, as you may gather, those of you who have not been in my class, you will not know, but those who have will understand. One of my favorite historical characters is Winston Churchill. And one of his sayings that I've always loved is, it's always easier to prophesy after the event. So we need to keep that in mind. But clearly, I think that's a question that underlies all of this discussion. Sheila?
My name is Sheila Moran. I live in Lebanon. And actually my question, or the concern that is very much on my mind, is, I think we'll probably get to the last day, and that's about the sort of threat that's hanging over the country, with the thought that Trump might maneuver somehow with trying to get Sessions back in the picture to fire Mueller. My read of Nader et al. Versus Bork is that it would be a very dumb, added to a list of other dumb things, maneuver on Trump's part, because the law would be very much against doing that, I think.
George?
George Sutherland. My question is really kind of an extension of one that's already been posed. That is, in case that the House impeaches Trump, can he pardon himself prior to the Senate vote?
Okay. Jim?
Jim Anto is my name. In a government of checks and balances, I keep wondering, with the right of the president to pardon, where does Congress come in on any of this? Do they have any type, if they have the chutzpah to do it, do they have any counterbalance to the president?
Sandy?
Sandra Johnson. I'm rather naive about this topic, that's why I'm here, but it seems that our present president seems to feel that he has carte blanche on almost anything. And that worries me, and it seems that with his bravado that he has been able to get away with more than usual. And where are the checks and balances, and is that something that people are going to be willing to cross the political line to uphold?
Nice question. Mike?
Mike Galbraith. My question is, do state constitutions allow governors to pardon for state offenses?
Nice question. The short answer is some do and some don't. But we'll talk about that in greater detail. In some cases, the legislature actually can pardon, or in New Hampshire, it's the governor with the approval of the executive council. Anyway, Eileen.
Eileen Clausen. Before Trump ran for president, the only thing I knew about him was he was a wealthy celebrity. Never watched his TV show or anything. And I'm curious, has anybody heard him give speeches in his earlier days as compared to now? Because what I'm very concerned about and wonder about is, could he be in the beginning stages of dementia? How can somebody with such a good education be so inarticulate? And how can he keep repeating the same words over and over? One has to wonder, can he not pull out other words?
Do we have psychiatrists here?
And if that's the case, what could be done about it? It wouldn't be the first time we had a president with memory problems.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Faith, Kaplan. What are some of the most effective things citizens can do right now in terms of damage control?
Fair question, Faith.
Bob Steinberg. My question is kind of all-encompassing. Do our laws help or hinder the finding out of the truth?
I think that's a nice underlying question. And we have three lawyers, so we can be on all three sides of that issue here. Yes, Marty.
Marty Blumberg from Thetford. The reason I'm here is to really learn more about pardoning, amnesty, and clemency, even though I don't think, because of the political environment, that much is going to happen on any of those fronts.
Martha.
Martha Caskey. I'm probably even worse than a lawyer. I'm a second-generation journalist, so I'm always interested in the facts, and I'm wondering, rather than continually debating what Trump has done lately, what could we actually expect our Congress to do something about it if they ever show a backbone?
Marion.
Mary.
first-generation journalist. I'm here to see, how do we survive this as a country? What's going to happen to the United States?
Well, I think that we've heard, you know, a little different slice on a similar question, but I think that's an underlying query. Yes, Patty.
I find in the aura that we find ourselves in today, the subject of the ability to pardon that one person has a little frightening.
Mm-hmm. Dave?
Dave Bradley. I'm a local lawyer. I practice across the street. I'm wondering, the article you had us read, the law review article on can he pardon himself, that was a terrific, in my view, a terrific legal piece and argument. I haven't gone looking very hard, but I'm wondering, is there a good counter to that, or what would the counter be? And
okay, we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
There are some counters. One of the things we'll find in this subject matter is that there aren't a lot of 100% yay or nay. Bill.
Bill Emerson. I'm wondering if we will really get to the bottom of the Russian connection.
Yeah.
And will we be able to follow the money trail?
What is this Russia thing? Barb?
Margaret Jones, and I would be interested in really everything that people have asked here. I'm also interested in the simple definition and differences between pardons and censures and impeachments and reprieves and all of that. I'm
Right.
sure you'll be covering them. I would like to get that clear.
Sandy.
Sandy, I agree with all the questions. Just I had forgotten about pardons, but the last one that really upset me was Clinton's pardon of
Mark Rich?
Yes.
Yeah. A famous one.
Yes.
And there are a bunch of other famous ones.
But that one stuck in my head.
Well, that's. I think that's very interesting. It gives us a little background and something to go on. So let's move on, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the materials which I sent out to you. There are no quizzes in this class, so you don't have to worry about answering any questions. So I sent you, among other things, a syllabus, which I'd like to just quickly go over with you. Week 1, Session 1, and we're going to do today a brief history of amnesty and pardons, with a particular focus for a short time on American history. And then we'll talk about some definitions. That question's been raised between pardons and commutation and remission and that kind of stuff. Brief discussion on quote-unquote political pardons. And then I think we may get to the question, which I think is a very interesting one, of who can the president fire and when. And there's an old case, Myers versus the United States, that's actually about a postmaster who was fired by a president that I want to talk with you about. And then when can he appoint, or whom can, and that's now a relevant issue because you'll recall that Richard Cordray, who was stepped down as the chair of the commission that was established under the Dodd-Frank bill, was replaced by, well, when Cordray stepped down, he appointed his successor, who was the deputy. And the law that set up the commission specifically said that he could do that. But Trump appointed the guy who's the head of the CIA, I think, to take that position as well. And the first action that was brought in court. The court threw out the attempt by the Cordray, I think her name is English, her last name is English, and Leander English, I think. Anyway, that case is still in court, but the question about who the president can appoint will also be relevant when we talk about the possible firing of Mueller or Sessions or anybody else. Next week, we're going to be talking, well, at the end of this week, we're going to be talking about collusion, a term I don't know why anybody uses. It's the only term you hear, and it's a completely irrelevant, non-legal term, except in antitrust terms, and we're not talking about it in any event. We're going to talk about collusion, conspiracy, and the famous obstruction of justice. We'll talk about the constitutional basis for the power of the presidency. 20 words here, where this arrow is. He shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. Those 20 words encompasses all of this discussion and more. We'll talk about emoluments, another beautiful word that the founders threw in there, and the 25th Amendment. We'll talk about the appointment of a special counsel, Mr. Mueller's role. We'll talk about Congress and what it is that they're doing. I'm not sure exactly what it is that they're doing. And then raise the question about under what conditions, if any, can the President of the United States be indicted? A very interesting question. Next week, after we pick ourselves up off the floor, we'll talk more about impeachment, high crimes and misdemeanors. We'll go back to a brief overview of Nixon, Clinton, and a bunch of federal judges who have been impeached over the years. We'll get to the question of can a president pardon himself? We'll talk about judicial review. What role do the courts play in all of this? And then our last session will be devoted to politics. Actually, this is all politics, fortunately or unfortunately. And the rule of law. I want to draw what would a constitutional crisis look like? What do we mean by a constitutional crisis? And then if we have time at the end to kind of talk about whether the federal pardon power that we have now is appropriate, whether it's too broad, too narrow. There actually have been a number of proposed constitutional amendments over the years, all of which have gone exactly nowhere. So we'll talk about one of those in particular, which I think is interesting. Now, moving on to the reading packet contents. I just want to quickly run through these with you. I picked these out of many dozens of things I might have sent. The first item is a bibliography, and the reason that I chose this is because it was the latest book I could find that had been published on the presidential pardon power. It was written by a professor at the University of Kansas, Jeffrey Crouch, in 2009. I believe this book is out of print, but I did obtain a copy from the New Hampshire Library group, and it's an interesting book. I think it's nicely done. And he had what I thought was an interesting bibliography. I've made it available to you. And then there's the Congressional Research Service report on an overview of the presidential pardoning power. There's a memorandum here from the counsel for President Nixon on material for use in Ford's statement when he was pardoning Nixon, the decision regarding Nader v. Bork, a memorandum for the U.S. pardon attorney, the case on the U.S. versus Sheriff Arpaio, who I gather is naturally running for the Senate. And then I included some clemency statistics presented by the Office of the DOJ. We're going to talk about that. There is a pardon attorney. There has been a pardon attorney for 100 and more years in the Office of the Department of Justice. And then the standards for consideration of clemency petitioners. We'll talk about that today. The majority opinion on ex parte Garland, which is an important case in all of this law, which has been whittled away at over the years by the justices. And then this final case against presidential self-pardons. I think that was the one that somebody referenced, Dave, in the Yale Law Journal on presidential self-pardon. So I think that's interesting in and of itself. As I say, there's much more that we could talk about.
Question.
Yes, Mike.
Is there a website to pick up all this information in OSHA? There is somewhere. But you don't have to type in this horrible long thing to find it.
No.
Google Drive.
Google Drive has in other words, the Google Drive document, the Google Drive material, all of this material that's referenced here is on Google Drive. And you were sent, all of us were sent an email back 6-8 weeks ago. And that email has the, what's the word I'm looking for? The link, thank you. The link, the URL link, so that every one of those documents is on the Google Drive.
But the other class I'm taking, I couldn't open it, and they showed me if you push your finger, at least on an iPad, hold it down on that link, it will open up. Because if you go to Google Drive, you don't necessarily see it, but if you do that, it will open it up and download it.
If you can't find the email, call the OSHER office and have them resend it to you.
The email was dated about December 15th.
I just don't have the date in front of me, but thank you.
You said...
Right. So I'd like to just say a few words also about my background, specifically with regard to this. I did go to law school. I took several courses on constitutional law. I am not a constitutional lawyer. I don't pretend to be a constitutional lawyer. And so, as I said earlier, I'm not here trying to sell you any position or any stance. I am here to try and explain what I think the positions may be of the various parties, and you are free to take whatever positions you feel based on not only what I have to say, but what you read and what your fellow class participants have to say. So I started out by sending you, and I don't know how many of you paid attention, but I sent along what I called a prologue. It's a single page, and it has 4 quotations on it, and I wanted to just take a moment to explain why I took the time to do this. I wasn't trying to be a wise guy, really, but the first one, the law is such an ass. This is, for those of you who know Dickens, will know that this is out of Oliver Twist. Mr. Bumble, who is a famous character, actually, and he's unable to control his wife. And in those days, in England, the men controlled their wives legally. They had to control them, and they were in control. And when Mr. Bumble was summoned to court for various and sundry things, the judge said to him, Mr. Bumble, you are responsible for your wife's actions and everything she says. And his response was, the law is an ass. Is actually what he said was a ass in Dickens' vernacular. So the next one is, of course, a very famous one, although not everybody knows that it comes from Henry VI, Part 2, when they're talking about revolution. And Dick the Butcher says, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. Having been at Harvard Law School for 3 years, I couldn't agree more. I think killing all the lawyers is not a bad start, whether it's a revolution or not. But one of the things we're going to find here is that the lawyers don't agree on most of these issues.
Can I answer?
Sure.
It's not really advocating killing all the lawyers. It's saying if you want to create chaos and a revolution and get rid of civil rights and representation, then kill all the lawyers.
Well, I think that's a fair statement. And you know, query, are we moving in that direction? So the next thing is a quote from the Mock Turtle story by Lewis Carroll, the Duchess to Alice. The more there is of mine, the less there is of yours. I can't think of a better quote for what we are seeing today in our society. And the final one, Hans Christian Andersen, of course, The Emperor's New Clothes, when the child says to his mother, as the emperor is being led through the street, but he hasn't got anything on. And I think, again, this is something that many people feel is a part of what we are witnessing at this time. So let's, without any further ado, begin. In order to put the pieces of this, well, I want to, we talked a little bit about, somebody mentioned Mark Rich, we've mentioned Richard Nixon. There are a number of other pardons throughout history that created consternation and concern, or that were interesting. I just wanted to read off a list of names of people who have been pardoned over the years that you may or may not realize. Jimmy Hoffa, Brigham Young, James Michael Curley, famously in Boston, pardoned. He actually was a mayor when he was in a federal prison, pardoned after his term was up. Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis were pardoned. George Steinbrenner, owner of the Yankees, was pardoned after tax fraud and contribution problems with political contributions. Dan Rostenkowski, famously former speaker. Mark Felt, who was Deep Throat, famously, was actually pardoned after he was convicted of authorizing illegal break-ins, not with regard to the Nixon thing, but with regard to the Weather Underground matters in 72 and 73. Does anybody remember the name Samuel Mudd? Dr. Samuel Mudd. That's right. Samuel Mudd was the doctor who treated Abraham Lincoln. And the courts found that he had conspired with Booth and was, in any event, he went to jail and was later pardoned. Another one on this list, Peter Yarrow.
I just saw him a week ago.
Puff the Magic Dragon was pardoned. He was, no, there was apparently a young man who came up to his dressing room very early on in his career. And anyway, he went to jail for 3 months and was eventually pardoned many years later. So the list, of course, goes on and on. Just to give you an example, as best I can tell, we're talking now pardons. There have been somewhere between 21 and 22,000 pardons since the Republic was founded, going back to Washington and all the way through. Some such number. Bev?
Are those all federal?
Those are all federal. That's correct. The state is a whole different story. Good point. 21 to 22,000. That doesn't include amnesty. I'm going to talk, that's a separate thing. Separate thing. 21 to 22,000 pardons. Some of this list, you know, a dozen or so names, people we may all have heard of. But most of these people, 98 to 99% of the people who were pardoned are people who you and I never heard of, don't know anything about, weren't concerned with. It doesn't mean it wasn't important to those people. Their lives were obviously tied up in this. But the kinds of pardons we're going to be talking about, the kinds of issues we're going to be talking about, do not apply to that group of people. That 98 or 99% are the people who there are lots of other issues. And I'll get to those in just a moment.
Maynard, who pardoned Jimmy Hoffa?
Nixon, I think. So we have, this is like a puzzle in a sense. And I wanted just to, without at the moment trying to put the pieces together, I wanted to give you an idea about what some of these pieces were that we're dealing with. And I think almost every one has been mentioned in your questions so far to date. The special counsel, the possibility of an indictment of the president or of other people by the special counsel, impeachment, the 25th Amendment, which kind of is rolling around the floor here. Executive privilege. Wow, there's a beauty. You know, what is that really? And what role does it play? Obstruction of justice. And then we have matters like, well, we have matters that are civil and we have matters that are criminal. And some of the things that Mueller may be investigating may be civil, but actually he's really supposed to be concentrating on criminal matters. Then there are matters that are official, and there are matters that are private or unofficial. If President Clinton had some activities with Monica Lewinsky in the Oval Office, were those part of his official duties, or were they private acts? Well, I think most of it would say they were private acts. So does that make a difference in our evaluation or in the legal evaluation of the activities? Then we have subpoenas. We have judicial subpoenas, and we have congressional subpoenas. And they may have different consequences and different issues raised because of them. So these are just some of the, and then of course we have a timeline question. Let's say that the president was responsible for doing something prior to his inauguration as part of the campaign. And then let's say he's responsible perhaps for doing something else after he becomes inaugurated. What effect does that timeline, does the inauguration have on the legality of his responsibilities? So these are just some of the issues. George?
Does the time between election and inauguration, is there any difference as far as liability to the kinds of things you're talking about?
Well, I think that's a nice question. My take is that for the most part here, the issue would be, for these questions, would be prior to inauguration and after. That the election piece, because he would not have taken office, would basically not be as relevant in these matters. So, I thought I would give you an example. We talk about an example of two pardons that are worlds apart in more ways than one. Before we start, just to get an idea of what the differentiation can be. Let's talk first about the pardon for Sheriff Joe. I sent you, I believe, the case. It was on the Google Drive on Arpaio versus the U.S. when he tried to get the action actually expunged from his record. When you get a pardon, in most cases, the pardon is a pardon for the act that you are alleged or that you committed. And however, that does not expunge or erase that act from your record automatically. There was cases way back that said that it did, but that really is no longer the case. So Sheriff Joe appealed and lost the appeal. He lost the initial case in the district court. He's lost in the appellate. He's now appealing to the appellate court, which is the Ninth Circuit. I don't think they're going to even hear the case. But in any event, and of course we know he's running for the Senate. But what I think is interesting about Sheriff Joe and this pardon process is, you know, how much time do you think the president spent researching this? You know, this was over a burger and some fries, I think. So, you know, Sheriff Joe was in office for 24 years. Boy, that says something about the people of Maricopa County in Arizona, I gotta tell you. And re-elected, he was elected and re-elected 6 times. So this guy, in that period of time, I need my glasses here. You know, I had cataracts removed, and now I can't see anything. Actually, no, the only thing I need them for is reading at this point, which is good, if there's something to read. So in the 24 years that Arpaio was in office, he was accused and sued for abuse of power, misuse of funds, failure to investigate sex crimes, improper clearance of cases, unlawful enforcement of immigration acts, election law violations. The Department of Justice said that his administration was the, quote, worst pattern of racial profiling in U.S. history, unquote. He was sued by the state, he was sued by the Department of Justice, he was sued by inmates, he was sued by former inmates, he was sued by employees, he was sued by former employees, he was sued by civil rights groups and the Department of Justice. Who does he remind you of? Anyway.
Were you acquitted of all of them?
What? No, what I'm going to say is, the county paid over $100 million in fines, fees, and costs over that 24-year period. $10,000 a day for every day this man was in office.
Over how much money?
$100 million.
How can he afford that?
So,
So with that record, why did the people keep re-electing him at up to 80% of the population? That happens to be Arizona.
Bob, what can I tell you? What can I tell you? Now, my point is, this guy is the poster boy for, and if you look at I haven't got the details in front of me, but I've read them, his record of enforcement. You'd say, well, he was a great sheriff because he put many of the people he put in jail never should have been in jail. They were in jail because of racial profiling. And the people he should have put in jail were not in jail. So his record of law enforcement was amongst the worst in the Southwest over the years. I can't answer Bob's question. I don't have an answer. Why did the people keep electing him? Your guess is as good or better than mine.
Because he ran on a law and order position that the immigrants, undocumented immigrants coming over the border were ruining their life. I mean, again, sound familiar? And they believed that he would do something about that scourge on...
But that was a political issue.
So
there may be a legal issue.
But do we not know and understand that underneath all of this, including these wonderful words written by our forebears and others, is that there are political considerations that creep into this. And those are very difficult to prognosticate on. And so what do we have? We have this statement: the president shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States. That means that the president, the courts have said, that means that the president can pardon anybody he wants to pardon for any reason, basically, and there may be a caveat here, at any time. Any time maybe not quite, but in any event, he can pardon any person. Now, there is an office of the pardon attorney. We're going to talk about that later. And there's a process that you have to go through. People have to appeal. They have to serve their sentence before they can appeal their pardon. Before they can appeal for a pardon. Or they have to serve some portion of that sentence. Well, Mr. Trump made this decision without consulting anybody, as far as we know. He certainly didn't consult anybody in the Department of Justice, in the Office of the Pardon. Whether he consulted anybody in the West Wing, I have no idea. But he didn't have to. And if you go back in history, this idea of political pardons is a relatively new concept. We go back, for example, to Mr. Clinton, who served 8 years. And for the first 8 years and 11 months and 3 weeks, he pardoned about roughly 200 people. That's all. And on the last day of his presidency, he pardoned 177 people. None of those people went through the office of the pardon attorney. Those were all personal pardons. Mark Rich was one. Roger Clinton was another. And there are a whole slew. Clinton's college roommate was pardoned. There are a whole slew that is another example. If you were to look at that list of 175 people, you'd shake your head, as indeed many people did at that time, saying this is disgraceful, etc. So there's another example of kind of an abuse, perhaps, of the pardon power. Going back a little further, there were examples. We had the Ford pardon of Nixon is really in a class by itself, and we'll talk about it, I think, separately. But there are others. The pardon of Weinberger, and the issue around Iran-Contra. But in our lifetimes, and more recently, the idea of political pardons has become much more relevant. Interestingly enough, going way back, these were very rare occurrences. So we now have situations where this has become more common, and is something that, yes?
But are these the obvious ridiculous ones? Are they crimes against the United States?
Well, they're all federal crimes.
But they're not crimes against the United States.
Well, because they're federal, they are deemed to be crimes against the. In other words, it doesn't have to be treason, or it doesn't have to be bribing a federal official. If it's it could be mail fraud or election.
What did Arpaio do that was against the United States?
It was a criminal. I'm sorry.
Civil rights.
Well, yeah, but it was the actual action was a criminal contempt. It was criminal. It was contempt of the court, the federal court. He did not do what the court said he had to do. So that was the federal offense.
And Rich?
Well, Rich that's a long story.
But Arpaio wasn't, I don't put that in the category, I mean, Trump did for political reasons, but he wasn't in trouble because he violated rules and regulations or laws.
Well, he could have been put in jail.
That's right.
By the judge,
right,
if he hadn't been pardoned. So.
Didn't you say 22,000 pardons since the beginning of the country?
Yes.
Okay. How many of them have been politically motivated and driven, or are they, because all 22,000 of these people violated the laws, and they went through the judiciary process, and they were found guilty?
Yes.
So, you're taking Joe, Pink Panties Joe.
Yes.
And people, all 22,000 of these people had a political twist involved.
Well, I think let me say I hear you, and let me go to the next pardon that I was going to talk about, and that comment I think is an interesting one. We're going to come back basically to that on several occasions, Bob, here. So, I'm sorry. Yes, Marty.
I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, having already done so, but could you talk about Scooter Libby? He didn't get pardoned, but when you finish what you were going to...
Well, yeah, Scooter Libby.
Scooter didn't get pardoned.
The best story about Scooter Libby, who was, with the Bush administration, was that the FBI went to interview Dick Cheney in the, I think it was in the White House, I'm not sure. It may have been in the Blair House where his office was. But they went to interview him as part of the review for the pardon. And the interview lasted 7 minutes. And in 7 minutes, Dick Cheney said, I can't recall 125 times. So that was one, I think that says it all. But obviously there's more detail than that. So let me now give you kind of 180 degrees away from that. How many of you remember Here's one for you. Tokyo Rose. Wow. Tokyo Rose. So, it turns out, first of all, there were a number of women who were Tokyo Rose in the Pacific during World War II. But this particular lady was a Japanese American. She was born in the United States in 1916 in Los Angeles. She graduated from high school. She went to UCLA with a degree in zoology. She spoke fluent English with no accent. And then she was visiting her family in Japan in 1941 when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And she was denied re-entry into the United States. She refused to renounce her U.S. citizenship. So her Japanese family, she had relatives in Japan, banished her from the house. So now, she had nowhere to go. She couldn't get into the United States. Her Japanese family didn't want her. So she went to work for a Japanese broadcaster, and there was a show called 0 Hour, which actually, if you listen to it carefully, it was first of all, there was some commentary, there were songs, you know. It was really a fairly sarcastic program. But clearly the Japanese didn't get it, and frankly, either did the Americans. In 1945, after the war, she was paid $2,000 by Cosmopolitan magazine. And she bylined an article called "I Was Tokyo Rose." And that story led to her undoing. Basically, the authorities said that this was her confession. She was imprisoned in a Japanese jail and eventually sent back to the United States for trial. In 1949, she was charged with treason. The 13-week trial, 13 weeks, at that time was the most expensive and longest trial ever in America. 8 counts of treason she was tried on. By a jury, she was convicted of 1 count. These were the words that convicted her. "Orphans of the Pacific, how will you get home now that your ships are sunk?" That's treason? She got a $10,000 fine, 10 years in prison, and she lost her U.S. citizenship. After 6 years, when she was 40 years old, she was pardoned by Gerald Ford when, or after it was discovered, that a number of the witnesses in the trial had been pressured to lie by the judge who was conducting the trial. The whole thing was a sham and a scam. So here was a lady who never got to see her mother die because she was in jail. She had been married for a short time back in the United States to a man named D'Aquino. So her name was Iva Takuri D'Aquino. They deported D'Aquino back to Portugal. She never was able to see him again. And so she was pardoned in 1977, and she died in 2006.
Was she allowed to stay in the States?
Yes. No, she was pardoned. So when she got her citizenship back, but she had paid the fine, she had spent 6 years in jail, she had lost her child, she had lost her husband, she had lost her mother. Her life was basically over. So, Bob, to your question, you know, that's one example. There are many others. But this, this is to my mind, kind of 180 degrees away. I don't actually know, as I'm speaking to you, whether the Department of Justice, how deeply the Department of Justice was involved, but because of the detail, I have a feeling that Ford had a lot of information about the activities in and around the trial that wouldn't have been available to, just somebody. So there's an example of someone who I think we could agree, deserved, quote unquote, a pardon. So those are kind of the two extremes. And so let's talk now a little bit about the history of this and see if we can, the whole concept of pardons takes us back to a phrase that we're all familiar with. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. How many hundreds of times have we all said those words in church or at funerals or whatever over the years? And maybe we don't pay much attention. They're kind of in our, they're in the lexicon. But that really is the concept. Forgive us our trespasses. And so this goes all the way back to the days of the Bible and the nations of that time, where mercy and forgiveness was a part of the concept. And then as you come through the history, through the Greeks and the Romans, there's a continuing, the god of Clemency is the god of clemency in the Roman lexicon. And so, however, in those days and in those societies, clemency was reserved for the rich people. The ordinary guy in the street got no clemency, or gal, clearly.
Is that because they weren't landowners?
Well, among other things. They just weren't, they were just people. They were not, they didn't have rights under, there was no constitution per se, but, they just, so an example, I remember reading when I was doing some research, a case, a woman who was inside a building, opened a door she couldn't see through to a balcony. And in so doing, she pushed a child off the balcony into boiling water, and the child died. So the woman had no idea the child was out there, but she was, she was convicted of murder. These are the kinds of things that were kind of common at that time. All homicides were felonies, and typically when you got a pardon in those kinds of communities or in those nations, you had to come up with something in return. It wasn't just something that was bestowed upon you. Then when we get into the Europe, and in particular into Britain, we have the struggle between the monarchy and the parliament, the kings, and prior to the 17th century, the monarch's power was absolute. It was under British, it's not British, under the English law at that time, technically the monarch couldn't even think of a crime. It was not possible to think of a crime because he or she was the monarch. We know that that certainly is not the case. Then when England broadened its boundaries and came to the New World, settled the New World, the pardoning power followed and was delegated to basically the executive. So in 1624 in Virginia, when they became a royal colony, the governor was the pardoner, and there was a charter for New England. And then after the Revolutionary War, the The states were a very weak confederacy, remember. And they basically curtailed the pardoning power because they were afraid of this kind of chief executive. So there was no executive pardon power during that time. And in the New Hampshire Constitution of 1784, only the legislature could suspend and execute the laws, and they were basically the only ones at that time who could offer a pardon. So the history of civilization shows that where secrecy cloaks the use of power, it also cloaks the abuse of power. And then when you get to the Constitutional Convention, and you get to the writings of Madison and Hamilton in the Federalist, there are a couple of places where pardons are discussed. But basically, they spent surprisingly little time on this issue. And this is the result. These 20 words, which is basically all we have. So you'll see in the history, if you go into it, that there are quotes from Hamilton. We can talk about this when it comes to indictment, but in any event, really there's very little in terms of direction that comes out of that. So we have about 6 or 7 terms that I think I want to go over with you because they're relevant here. The pardon itself, first of all, the pardon bears no relationship to the punishment. The pardon can be for anything if it's a federal offense. The pardon basically, what it does is it exempts from punishment if there hasn't been any punishment to that time. If there has been punishment, then obviously you cannot retract what's already been done. What's amnesty? What's the difference between amnesty and a pardon? Well, the big difference is amnesty is for a number of people, a group, typically. And it's usually granted to groups prior to conviction. And there are dozens of examples. Let me just read a few to you here because it goes through our history. Under Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion, the farmers in Pennsylvania, I think, challenged the right of the federal government to tax whiskey. And anyway, Washington pardoned, I think there were 2 people finally who got amnesty. Madison had 3 different amnesties, including deserters in the War of 1812. Jefferson, who didn't believe in the Alien and Sedition Acts, gave amnesty to many people who were convicted under those acts. During the Civil War, Lincoln received petitioners at the White House. He was one of the few presidents ever to do that, and gave out Civil War amnesties, military officers. And President Johnson, who followed him, many people thought he would be the exact opposite of Lincoln in that respect, but in fact, Johnson continued those amnesties, and in 1868, he actually pardoned all the Civil War.
1868?
1868.
Oh, that Johnson.
That Johnson. Sorry. Andrew Johnson of impeachment fame. So, Teddy Roosevelt, there was an insurrection which he in which he granted amnesty. Wilson, these were Volstead Act violators, people who were selling booze. He gave an amnesty to many of those people. Harding, for people during the World War I recruitment. Harry Truman did this during, after World War II in Korea, where ex-cons had served in as soldiers, and he gave those people amnesty. And then, of course, in 1977, Carter famously gave amnesty to the Vietnam War draft dodgers, although it did not apply to people who had gone AWOL or to deserters. But that was estimated at somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. There are a lot of people who were involved. Kennedy and Johnson gave drug offenders amnesty. And so this has continued over. Reagan perhaps gave the greatest amount of all during his immigration bill, when almost 3 million people got amnesty for various and sundry immigration.
Who gave that?
Reagan.
Oh, Reagan.
Yeah. And then, so my point in this, I've not totaled up, I don't know if it's possible to, the number of people who have gotten amnesty, but it's a lot of people, a lot of groups. And there's good reason for this, because the idea here was that to heal the country and to bring people together after some of these unfortunate events, obviously some more unfortunate than others, but nevertheless, the idea was that amnesty had an important place in our society, and so the president and many of them here took advantage of that. Then there's, yes?
So, to clarify in my mind.
Sure.
Amnesty is identical to a pardon except that it applies to a group of people.
Well, I'm not sure I would quite say that. I think I would say that amnesty is part of this process that applies to a group of people.
The effect is right?
And, well, the effect is pretty close, but typically these are people who, yes, yeah, it's close. But, you know, it's not, the question is, if you can pardon one person 10,000 times, why can't you pardon 10,000 people once? And I think the court has held, you can, in fact, do that.
Does the pardon attorney become involved in the amnesty process?
Not generally. Not generally. It's usually, that's more of a political process than the others. So the pardon the pardon attorney is not usually involved, but it could be. There's a whole office of people. I don't know how big it is today, but there is an office of people who could theoretically conduct research and provide memos to the president on that. Yes.
There's also a clarification, but I think you said earlier, and I think I read that in the pardon, you're exempt from punishment, but the fact of the conviction
stays. That's correct.
So that can haunt you for certain kinds of, you know, for...
Yes, and as a matter of fact, somebody asked me during the break if, for example, if you were practicing law or whatever, did that mean that, you know, you automatically got your license back? And the answer is it doesn't automatically mean that. You may get your license back, but that's a separate issue.
And in the case of amnesty, is it that it's almost as though with amnesty and the pardon of a larger group, that what had been deemed a crime, a federal offense, has sort of been washed clean?
I think that's generally so. And typically amnesties are given prior to conviction.
Okay.
So that's also another difference between the pardon and the amnesty.
Thank you.
Is amnesty in the Constitution? The word amnesty?
I don't believe so, but I don't know the answer to that, Peter. Commutation. A commutation substitutes sentences from, heavier to lighter. But it doesn't remove, it doesn't remove a stain or a privilege. So that I can commute your sentence from let's say, life imprisonment to 20 years or something, time served or whatever. Commutation. It's basically a conditional pardon. And there were questions early on about whether the president could give a conditional pardon. And the court ruled that they could give a conditional pardon. A remission. A remission is a criminal fine or forfeiture. So let's say that you've been fined X dollars. If you've paid the fine, you're pretty much out of luck. The only people who can give you the money back is Congress, and that likelihood is pretty remote. So the president can't give you remission, but if the fine hasn't been paid, he may give you a remission or a forfeiture. A reprieve, a temporary postponement, let's say awaiting an appeal. You might get that, which is not much different than a respite, which is a respite basically is a delay of an ordered sentence. So if you've been sentenced, if you've been, the judge's ruled you have to start your sentence on March 1st, you might get a respite saying you don't have to start until August 1st to give you a chance to finish your appeal or whatever. Then you have, we've already mentioned this phrase, expungement, where the records are actually destroyed or sealed. Now, for example, for many years, young kids, underage kids, who, let's say, were arrested for shoplifting or some such crime in any place, in a city or a town or whatever. And that would typically be on their record unless there was a way to get the record sealed. Now, this was not a federal offense. But my point is, if you can get the record sealed, then that single offense against that young man or woman or whatever would not be on their record for the rest of their life. So that's expungement. And then, of course, we have immunity. And where do we see that? Well, we see that by the guy sitting down at the table and saying, you know, I refuse to answer on the grounds that, I'm going to, give myself a problem, or words to that effect. And then the prosecutor, whoever may be hearing the case, may be able to give immunity to that person in exchange for their testimony. Now, in addition, in our own lives, we see amnesty in some other ways. At the library, every year, you return library books. You get an amnesty for paying the fine. That's basically what it is. Or if you turn in guns in some towns or cities that you're not supposed to have, you get an amnesty when you turn them in, even though you may have had these guns illegally. So there are examples of these descriptors, really, that kind of permeate our lives. So I think what's key for us is that the justification for the pardon power is multifold. One, anybody who's wrongfully convicted. You know, we've had in this country, there have been many movies, many books written about people who have been wrongfully convicted, whether because of racially motivated things or other things. You know, the development of DNA and all of those kinds of technological advances have made it possible for law enforcement to be much better at its job, perhaps than it has been in the past. So wrongful conviction certainly occurs where the punishment is not proportional. There are thousands of cases, and where you know, someone is convicted of a minor offense and given, you know, a punishment that is way out of line with what the crime was. To restore national unity, we talked about those cases in terms of amnesty. To forgive losers and end conflict. So I think those are the kinds of things for which pardons make sense. And I think nobody would argue that the pardon power should not exist. There have been questions over the years about who should have it. And indeed, at the Constitutional Congress, way back, there was discussion about giving this to Congress or giving it to the executive, and the decision was that it would better be served in one person rather than a group. Query. So, there's another whole factor in this that I think we ought to be aware of, and that is that in the last 50 years, maybe more, there's been a development with regard to there have been developments with the criminal justice system that have impacted the pardon process. What do I mean by that? Well, you know, today we have 1,700 state prisons. 1,700. We have 102 federal prisons. We have 901 juvenile detention facilities. We have 3,000 local jails. We have immigration detention centers. We have separate county Indian jail cells on Indian territory. 2.4 million people incarcerated in this country as we speak, and another 5 million in the parole system. 7.5 million people in this country are in this system. 7.5 million people. This is a staggering number, in my opinion. In the last 30 years, there's been a 350% increase in the prison population.
How many?
30.
30 years?
30 years, 350% increase. Now, this started, maybe, with the famous war on drugs. And of course, it's been propelled by our never-ending desire and our total failure to control the flow of drugs in any way, shape, or form. The latest number that I've been able to come up with is that we spend about $80 billion a year on incarceration. $80 billion a year. So what's happened, of course, is we've gone from the hard drugs to opioids. But the problem, of course, continues. In fact, it's actually accelerated. You can remember, we had mandatory minimum sentences. We had the famous 3 strikes, you're out. We had life without parole. All of those things have contributed to the disaster that we have with the criminal justice system in this country.
Also the privatization
of the prisons. That's another very interesting point. Now, unfortunately, this class is not the place for us to discuss all of those problems. But what I want to point out to you is they have an impact on the pardon process, because things like parole have have come in here, and basically in many cases have supplanted what the pardon process once was. Maybe we won't pardon this guy, but we'll parole him. And so a lot of these developments, cross currents, come across our paths and are a part of the process that I think we need to understand. And so what I would argue is that really what we've had in recent years is a decline of the pardon power. From 1900 to 2017, That's 117 years. From McKinley to Obama. I mean, that's the modern era for our purposes. None of us go back quite that far, I don't think. I'm getting close, but not quite there. There were about 14,000 pardons, an average of about 123 a year. But of course, that's not the way the pardons are issued. So if you look at FDR, who of course was in office for almost 4 terms, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower, they were in office for 24% of that period of time, and they issued between them 40% of the pardons. 24% of the time, 40% of the pardons. And then you look at Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush. They were in office for 28 years, and they issued about 7% of the pardons. So you can see this drop-off. Now, these are pardons. In fact, what happened with Obama, in the first couple of years, Obama didn't pardon anybody, and at the end, not at the end, but toward the end of his term, he issued a large number of commutations, a couple of thousand, but he issued very few pardons. So what he was doing was he was reducing sentences for presumably mostly drug dealers, or, excuse me, drug offenders. I don't know if they were dealers. But the pardon power per se, commutation is a part of it. But you look and see these changes going through a period of time, and it's interesting what you find. So I'd like to move along and see if we can, I wanted to show you this, this DOJ stuff. Well, here. I want you to see. This is a favorite.
Wish you'd stop being so good to me, Captain. Don't you ever talk that way to me. What we've got here is failure to communicate. Some men you just can't reach. So you get what we had here last week, which is the way he wants it. Well, he gets it. And I don't like it any more than you, man.
Cool Hand Luke. Anybody know that actor? Remember? Strother Martin. Whoa. What we have here is failure to communicate. Boy, I got to tell you, we got that in a big way in Washington. In a big way. And we don't have Strother Martin to take care of it. So let me put these statistics on if I can find them. So here, you'll see here, I haven't got my pointer. It's here somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, here it is. Okay. So here, this is for McKinley, and this is a year-by-year analysis. And so we have here the fiscal year, petitions pending, that's at the beginning of the year. Petitions received, and then granted. So here, in fact, they've come up with commutations, respites, remissions, no amnesty here. Petitions denied, and then closed without any action. And so this process goes on. And it's, as I say, this is a record that's been kept over the years and is available. There's Teddy, Taft, Wilson, and it goes through, there's FDR, Harry, Kennedy, Johnson, there's Ford, Carter, Reagan, and this is Obama. And note here, you'll note that there are a couple of things that happened here with Obama. One, you'll note that there's a huge jump in the number of petitions that were received. And that's because they started a new program to encourage people to apply for pardons. These were people who were incarcerated. Now, there's no fee to apply for a pardon if you're incarcerated. And, you know, there are forms to fill out and whatever, but there's no fee. And the process is, you know, it's lengthy. But in any event, you'll note here that, so this is an example, well, not an example. This is the record that the Department of Justice has. Now, so this presumably so this will show you how many petitions have been submitted to Mr. Trump already. And we have here, of course, he's only been in office a year. We have here the grand total of Sheriff Joe as number one. And our discussion will turn around how many more we may see, who we think perhaps might be the lucky recipient, etc. So, any questions on that? And then I also wanted to show you because I think these are interesting and important. These are the standards of consideration for the clemency petitioners. Here's a short history of the pardon attorney. And the U.S. attorney in the district of conviction. So if you're convicted in L.A. or New York or wherever, there's a U.S. attorney who has responsibility for that area. And it's that office that assists in putting together the material and comments on the desirability or lack of desirability of your case to move it forward. But these are very carefully written and have been developed over the years so that the intent here is to give people who are deserved of such an indication. So here, for example, your post-conviction conduct, character, and reputation, the seriousness and recentness of the offense, the acceptability of responsibility, remorse, and atonement. That's a good one for Sheriff Joe.
Yes.
The need for relief, official recommendations and reports. So all of this then would go to the Office of the Pardon Attorney, who would put the file together with a recommendation and send it to the President for his approval, or not, as the case may be.
Did that happen with Sheriff Jones?
No, none of this happened.
So how does he get around that?
Well, because we saw in the, I tried to make the point that because the President has the power, he can sit over a drink, he doesn't drink, a Coke, and say, I'm going to pardon Sheriff Joe, Mary, type it up. And that's what happens. Dave?
It says all petitions have to be approved.
Well, that's through the Office of the Pardon Attorney. The Constitution says something different.
We talk about the decidedly political elements of pardoning. I would guess that the decline that you indicated between the period roughly around FDR and Truman and Eisenhower versus what the more contemporaneous results is political pressure on the criminal justice system. That there was, ever since Reagan's time and the war on drugs started out, there's been this whole suppression type of an attitude.
I think that's a very important reason. What we've had, of course, is one, the greatest percentage of the convictions are drug-related as opposed to other things. And, you know, we continue to have this war on drugs, which we've been losing for 50 years, or close. And, you know, now I guess, I don't know, we're going to build a wall and we're not going to build a wall, I'm not sure. But clearly whether we do or we don't isn't going to have one iota worth of difference on our drug issues.
And they've done studies to show when a white person gets accused of using drugs and a black person does, the discrepancy with punishment is shocking.
That's a whole other, you know, that goes to this discussion of the criminal justice system and how the laws are applied. So there's no question about that. I mean, this is just one conversation, but I had a conversation with a couple. He was a criminal attorney in Boston for many years. He married a woman who was actually a TV commentator in Boston for many years. They now live down on the border in Arizona and New Mexico. And her family came from that area. And we had drinks not long ago with them. And he's long retired. And she's a very bright lady. And we were talking. And she said, you know, my family has been here for generations. And, you know, there are tunnels that were built 100 years ago, you know, that, you know, they're still using. And then she said, you know, that you know, when you get through with the tunnels, now she said they're sending all this stuff over on drones. So that, you know, you can't build a wall high enough to, I mean, you know, it's one conversation with one lady with, you know, but who does know the area and who's a woman of some achievement and talent and understanding. So
This is based on studies.
and right. So anyway, let's move on. I wanted you to get an idea as to what the official role here really was, and how. So I also want to talk, just mention New Hampshire. I know some of you are from Vermont, but there is such a thing as the Uniform Act on the Status of Convicted Persons. So why is that interesting or important? Well, this is the right to vote or hold office following conviction. And when is this restored to you? You may have read over the years that there's been a fuss about people who are felons voting in elections if they're in jail. And so these pardons are seen in New Hampshire. The pardon now can be granted with the governor with the advice of the Executive Council, who of course is 5 people. Presumably a 3-2 vote would either do it or not do it. An act of executive grace in New Hampshire completely removes all the consequences of the conviction, but it does not remove the record. They receive about 25 requests per year. During the time of John Sununu, there were about 17 pardons between 83 and 89. But aside from that, there haven't been many. Dave, you were involved in one you just mentioned.
Yes. Very interesting. It was a Dartmouth freshman off the Blackfoot Reservation named Billy Yellowtail. And he got too much to drink one night and went downtown and broke the window of the what was it? It was the photo place where you could buy camera shop. Yeah. I think it was called. And of course, he was prosecuted and convicted. And fast forward, whatever it was, most of 20 years or 15 years maybe, and he's trying to get a government job to pursue what he was then doing, which is working with young folks on the reservation. And it was quite a compelling thing. And I learned, I had never been involved in a pardon, but anyway, I learned that it was very rare in New Hampshire. But this was a compelling enough case that we got the governor and at least 3, I almost think it was unanimous vote of the council. Anyway, it's one of the things that I love to talk about, obviously. And Billy Yellowtail comes back and is, you know, a law-abiding citizen doing good work out there, and it's a great story.
That will part of it.
So I think that's another example of, you know, the reason why the pardon power exists. Yeah. I mean, without that, this poor guy wouldn't have been able to get that job, and his whole life, you know, was off in another tangent. Probably not a good one.
Is it just felons, though? Because one of the things my son keeps reminding me of, that down south, like particularly, people like who cannot afford to pay their fines get thrown in jail, and then they have a record because they couldn't pay their speeding fine or whatever. Do those people lose their voting rights?
Well, they may, but that's a state situation, not a federal. And while I don't want to, you know, but there are state violators. Each state has its own set of rules which are different from one another. Interestingly enough, the broadest pardon rules of all the states are in North and South Dakota. Why that should be, I haven't got the vaguest idea. But if you look at the, and we will, not here, but at some point, take a fast look at those. Each state has its own way of dealing with these. So there are a couple of other, I don't know, these are kind of interesting. What about a posthumous pardon? After someone has died, could the president pardon him or her? So that's interesting. Governors. Actually, governors have given a total of about 100 posthumous pardons over the years after people have died. In 1975, President Ford gave a posthumous pardon to Robert E. Lee, who had never been subjected to a judicial proceeding. He was granted a parole by President Grant, and he never was incarcerated. But he still had this record, and so Ford gave him a posthumous pardon. In 1999, Bill Clinton gave a posthumous pardon to Lieutenant Henry C. Flipper. Lieutenant Flipper was the first black American to graduate from West Point in 1881. Think about that. Where there was $2,400 in missing funds for which he was responsible. He did not take the money, but he didn't report it because he was going to undertake to replace it by himself. Well, it turned out that he wasn't able to do that. He was caught before. He was dishonorably discharged. And so, over 100 years later, for whatever it was worth, he got a posthumous pardon from President Clinton. In 2008, President Bush gave a posthumous pardon to Charles Winder, who had smuggled 3 surplus B-17 bombers into Israel. And he was honored by the Israelis in 1961. He was kind of an Israeli hero. And in any event, he was buried in Jerusalem. And he wasn't Jewish, actually. But in any event, Bush gave him a posthumous pardon. In New York, Governor Pataki gave Lenny Bruce a posthumous pardon. Any of you ever see Lenny Bruce?
Yeah, but
I saw him in San Francisco a number of times.
where did he go? What was he convicted of?
Well, he was convicted of
vulgar, okay.
yeah.
No, I don't know.
No, but he was.
the guy?
No, he was the guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, he used words then that the president uses now. I don't. So, in Massachusetts, Governor Dukakis famously pardoned Sacco and Vanzetti. Not because he said that they were innocent, but because they didn't get a fair trial, which I think, in fact, virtually everyone agreed. And in Florida, Charlie Crist pardoned Jim Morrison from the Doors. So those are examples of posthumous pardons that have been.
What did Jim Morrison do?
I don't know. Probably a lot of things, but I don't. Yes, Bob.
Do all of these examples indicate that what we thought was a orderly judicial process have fallen through the cracks, or is the judicial process itself so blemished that the word justice becomes a farce?
Well, I think that that's a decision that I think everybody needs to make for him or herself. I think that these examples are, I mean, these posthumous things or some of the unusual things are examples of a flexibility that probably don't impact the system in any great way. But I would say that some of them, and it's up to each one of us to decide which ones, raise questions, I think, about their merit. And I think that as we go through the material and talk about the role of Congress and the role of the courts, is there an opportunity for them to play in this pen in any way, to have some say in what the president may choose to do or not to do. Some presidents over a period of time took more interest in this process than others, starting way back. But most of the older presidents, you know, going back to the 1800s, took it fairly seriously and spent time going over these folders. And as I say, Lincoln actually had people come to the White House and talk to them because he wanted to get to know these people that he was. There weren't many presidents who did that.
So am I gathering that in recent decades there have been more political decisions exercised by the president in the whole pardoning process, and attached to that is this an indication that well, now it gets kind of weird, that we are in some early stage of an outright revolution?
Well, I don't want to get there yet, Bob.
Not yet.
Maybe in the next 10 minutes. But
there are a lot of upright people, and they would do many, many things that may have been done in other countries that have had revolts.
I think, you know, as I say, I think that's something that we'll have a chance to kick around here. I think so far we're relatively modest in our you know, in our objectives and in our conclusions here. But I think that, the other thing I wanted to mention to you is this concept of a preemptive pardon. Preemptive. What do I mean by that? Well, a preemptive pardon, so if you look at the famous words of Gerald Ford when he talked to the country, you'll remember that he said to the effect that I am pardoning President Nixon for any acts that he committed or may have committed during the period between Baba and Baba. Now, that is what we would call preemptive. And that was perhaps the biggest stir that pardon created. Many people, many political scientists have said that single act ensured that Ford would never be reelected. We can discuss or argue about that.
Elected.
Reelected. But clearly,
Reelected.
well, thank you.
Yeah.
Right, elected.
Yeah.
Your point is well taken. So, my point is, you know, I don't know about that, but clearly it was a factor. And I think we would, so this question about preemptive, and we're going to get to that. And then I wanted just to mention to you there have been a couple of amendments to the pardon power which have been offered over the years. They've all been referred to the House Judiciary Committee, where they remain today, dead and buried. The first one says that you could not, this would be an amendment to the Constitution, because remember the president's pardon power, it just says, you know, he can pardon anybody, basically, would require a conviction before a person could be pardoned, and it would eliminate preemptive pardons. It's kind of a twofold thing. That was one proposed amendment. The second one, looking back to the Clinton days in particular, and also to Bush to a certain extent, would limit pardons during the lame duck period, after the president has been, after his office, you know, the next guy has been elected, and so now he can do whatever he wants. So there'd be calendar restrictions. And the third one, which I think perhaps is kind of the most interesting, was actually proposed by Vice President Mondale. And his suggestion was that all pardons by the president would go into effect unless within 90 days 2/3 of each House of Congress voted not to approve the pardon. A very interesting thought that some constitutional scholars have said, well, that changes the checks and balances, and it may. But anyway, none of these three options have gone anywhere, and I don't see at the moment any likelihood. I've never actually heard anybody even mention them, which doesn't mean they haven't been mentioned, but I haven't heard anybody mention them. And so that's kind of where that is.
But if Sheriff Joe goes on to do racial profiling and stuff, he could be convicted again. But he's not pardoned for.
No, that's correct. That's absolute. Well, he can't do racial profiling as a private citizen.
Right, yeah.
But that's correct. If Sheriff Joe commits another crime, you know, I mean, my own view is he's running for office because he's going to collect a lot of money, which he's going to put in his pocket, and you know, enhance his, you know, his estate and do what he wants. You know, he has no more intention. He may. I don't think he's going to win that race, but it's conceivable he could win the primary. I don't.
86?
And yeah, so you know, I don't give him a lot, but I think he's trying to raise some money. And you know, is that a crime? Well, I'm not going there, but so I think that's, so I don't think he's you know, he's moving in that direction. So let me, we don't have a long time here, But I'd like to take advantage of another few minutes and talk to you about a case which I think is an interesting one, and it's important in the history of pardon law. Ex parte Wells, 1855. We all remember that. So Mr. Wells was convicted of murder in the District of Columbia, making things even more complicated. He received a death sentence. Prior to the execution, the president pardoned him on the condition that he spend his life in jail. Remember, we talked about that commutation kind of. So Wells accepted the pardon. Then he appealed to the circuit court for habeas corpus, basically to get released, because he said the Constitution talked only about full pardons and that the president had no power to create a conditional pardon. So the circuit court rejected that argument, and he appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court held that this conditional pardon was in fact perfectly legal. So it was Taft, as Solicitor General, who said, if we can give an individual pardon to 10,000 people, why can't we give a single pardon? If we can give an individual pardon to 10,000 people, why can't we give a single pardon to 10,000 people? And that was in a case that was ex parte Garland, which was also an important case. Lastly, I think in a case called Biddle v. Perovich, 1927, Perovich is convicted of murder in Alaska. The conviction is affirmed by the Supreme Court, but there are various reprieves. And in 1909, President Taft commuted the sentence from death to life. Perovich says, I don't want your commutation. And so the government moved him to Leavenworth, which was, of course, a federal penitentiary. Since he had not accepted the clemency, he applied for a pardon. And the president denied it. So Perovich now applies to the Kansas court, he had a good lawyer, for a writ of habeas corpus, claiming that his commutation and removal were without his consent, and that therefore they were illegal. The district court actually ordered him to be released. The circuit court said, we don't know what to do with this, and they sent it to the Supreme Court. Question: did the president have the authority to commute the sentence of Perovich from death to life? And the court said yes, it did. That's an important case in the history of this process. Now, we need to remember the president cannot grant clemency for violation of state laws, and we're going to come back to that. He cannot change judgments in civil cases between individuals. So if you and I sue one another, the president can't interfere by pardoning or remitting something. He can't grant clemency in cases between the government and an individual, but he can release offenses by an individual in that case, so long as he doesn't impair the rights of third parties. So that if, there's money that's flowing from the government or whatever, he can't interfere in those kinds of activities.
I assume all these have been court tested.
They have. However, having said that, I think that we're going to see that the courts over the years have eaten away at some of these things. Now, one of the things we've heard on the news in the last few days, and I think it was with regard to Sheriff Joe, I'm not sure if it was Chris Matthews. No, somebody said to Sheriff Joe, do you know that by accepting a pardon, you've admitted guilt? And Sheriff Joe was like, he didn't know what was going on. So there's a nice question here. Can you accept a pardon for something for which you claim you're innocent?
You're rolling your eyes.
So, you know, I mean, that's an interesting question. Do you have to agree that you're a felon or that you're guilty in order to accept the pardon? And if you don't accept the pardon, where are you? And the courts have ruled, actually, in the case of a pardon, that it has to be accepted. There are several cases where the president has pardoned someone and changed his mind. And a couple of them go way back, where the pardon was delivered, you know, by either a guy on horse or whatever. And if they grabbed the guy on the horse before the pardon was delivered, that pardon was not valid. Now today, we don't have horseback guys delivering pardons. So, yeah, that's right, we have tweets. Could he pardon someone with a tweet? That's a very nice question.
You're not serious.
Well, I'm just raising the question. It's not whether I'm serious, it's whether he's serious. But, you know, this is a question that just occurred to me. Does a pardon have to take a specific form?
Yeah.
I'm not aware that it does. And I am guessing, and don't know, that if he sent a tweet saying, you know, I hereby pardon Joe Smith for, you know, that it would raise a ruckus, but I think it's probably, given what we've seen, there's a very good chance it would be declared a valid pardon. Well, is a tweet in writing? I don't know. I don't know. Well, it's 1:30, and I think we're coming back here on Thursday, same time. And